He was 80 years old, partially paralyzed on his left side, and confined to a wheelchair when the last journalist allowed into his life sat down across from him. By then, Burt Lancaster could no longer hold up the right corner of his own famous smile without effort. The stroke had taken his speech for the first several months and left him with a halting, deliberate way of forming words that made everyone in the room wait, sometimes for 10 or 15 seconds, before he finished a sentence. He hated being watched while he waited. People who visited him in that period say he would sometimes wave his good hand impatiently at the air, as if trying to physically pull the rest of the sentence out of himself faster than his damaged brain would allow. What follows is reconstructed from several overlapping accounts. Visitors' recollections, a handful of published interviews from his final years, biographers who spoke with people close to him, and the public record of his decline after 1990. No recording of his very last conversation with a journalist has ever surfaced, and accounts of what exactly was said differ in small but real ways. Where the record is uncertain, that uncertainty is worth saying out loud rather than papering over. The question itself was simple enough that it has been repeated, in roughly the same form, across nearly every second-hand account of that final period. Someone asked him whether he had any regrets. Not about his career, about his children. Lancaster had 5 of them from 2 marriages, and his relationship with most of them had been, by his own later admission, distant for long stretches of their lives. He had been on location more often than he had been home. He had been famous since his 30s, an acrobat turned movie star whose physical confidence on screen, the leaps in The Crimson Pirate, the open-shirted swagger of From Here to Eternity, was matched by a kind of restlessness off it that didn't leave a lot of room for being present at dinner tables. By the time the question was asked, most of his children were middle-aged. Some had reconciled with him, some had not, or had only partially. The people in the room that day describe him going quiet for longer than usual, even accounting for the slowness the stroke had left him with. One account has him starting to answer twice and stopping both times. Another has him simply turning his head toward the window. What is consistent across the versions is that he did eventually answer, and that whatever he said visibly affected him in a way nothing else in the interview had. His eyes filled, his breathing changed, and at least one person in the room remembers him asking, after a pause, to stop for a moment. To understand why that particular question landed the way it did on a man who had spent 6 decades being asked much more aggressive things by much more aggressive interviewers, it helps to go back to the beginning of how he became someone who was rarely home in the first place. He grew up in East Harlem, the son of a postal clerk, in a neighborhood where being able to handle yourself physically mattered more than almost anything else. He was a gifted athlete as a teenager, good enough at basketball to get a scholarship offer, and he ended up instead joining a circus as an acrobat in his late teens and 20s, touring with a partner named Nick Cravat in an act built on tumbling and trapeze work. That circus background is not incidental texture for a biography. It shaped how he moved for the rest of his life. On screen and off, there is a specific controlled physicality to nearly every Lancaster performance, a sense that he knows exactly where his body is in space that traces directly back to those years under canvas. It also gave him an early education in a kind of itinerant life. Arrive somewhere, perform, leave. He never fully stopped living that way, even once the circus stopped and the film career started. An injury ended the acrobatic career before Hollywood found him. He served in World War II, came home, and within a few years was on Broadway and then in front of a camera, an unknown with no formal acting training who landed a starring role in The Killers in 1946 almost by accident. He'd been performing in a play that closed quickly, and a producer who'd seen it thought his physical presence alone was enough to carry a film. It was. The picture made him a star essentially overnight at 33, with none of the years of bit parts most actors serve. What's worth sitting with is what happened next, because it is the part of his career that diverges sharply from most of his contemporaries. Lancaster did not let the studio system define what kind of star he was. Within a few years of The Killers, he had formed his own production company, one of the first major stars to do so, and started making decisions about material that had nothing to do with playing it safe. He produced and starred in Sweet Smell of Success, in which he played a viciously manipulative gossip columnist with no redeeming qualities, a role that risked the very likability his stardom had been built on. He sought out Elmer Gantry, a film about a con-man preacher that several studios were nervous about for its treatment of religion, and won the Academy Award for Best Actor for it in 1961. He kept choosing parts that complicated rather than reinforced his image. An aging gunfighter losing his nerve in Gunfight at the OK Corral, an alcoholic ex-con in Birdman of Alcatraz, an aristocrat watching his entire world die out from under him in Visconti's The Leopard, a film he made for far less money than he could have commanded elsewhere, because he wanted to work with that particular director on that particular material. That pattern, choosing difficulty over comfort, repeated itself in his politics as well, which is relevant because it is part of why his household life looked the way it did. He was an outspoken liberal in an industry where that carried real career risk during and after the blacklist era, when actors and directors he knew personally were being denied work over suspected communist sympathies. He spoke at rallies. He was, decades later, one of the speakers at the March on Washington in 1963, standing on the same platform as Martin Luther King Jr. He treated his public life as something with obligations attached to it, not just opportunities. And those obligations took time the same way film shoots took time. His first marriage, to June Ernst, lasted only a few years and produced no children. His second, to June Lancaster, no relation in name, only by coincidence of a shared first name with the first, which sometimes confuses casual accounts of his biography, lasted over 2 decades and produced 5 children: Bill, James, Susan, Joanna, and Sile. By most accounts, including Lancaster's own later reflections, he was a difficult man to be married to and a harder man to be raised by. Not through cruelty, but through absence and a volatile temper that several people who worked with him over the years described independently. He was known on sets for a quick, sometimes frightening anger that could surface and then pass within minutes, and people who knew the family say the same temper showed up at home. The marriage ended in 1969. By then, his oldest children were already adults or close to it, and the divorce, rather than bringing him closer to his family, seems to have widened an existing distance. He married a third time to Susan Martin, a marriage that also ended in divorce. His fourth and final marriage to Susan Scherer, a younger nurse he met after his health began declining, lasted until his death, and by most accounts was the steadiest domestic period of his adult life, which is itself a small irony worth noting, that the calmest stretch of his home life arrived only after the career that had crowded it out for decades was effectively over. The stroke came in late 1990, severe enough that doctors did not initially expect him to survive it, let alone speak again. He did survive, but the man who emerged from that recovery was not someone who could simply pick up the next role. The left side of his body was significantly weakened. His speech, as noted, came back slowly and never fully returned to normal. He used a wheelchair for the rest of his life. For a man whose entire screen identity had been built on physical command, the leap, the grin, the body that always seemed to know exactly what it was doing, the stroke took away something closer to his core than most actors lose when they age out of leading roles. It did not just end his career. It removed the specific thing that had made him who he was on screen for 45 years. It is in this period, largely out of public view, that the reconciliations with his children appear to have happened unevenly and not all at once. Some biographers describe visits that became more frequent as the decade went on. Others note that not every relationship healed, and that at least one of his children maintained distance from him for the remainder of his life. The record here is genuinely thin. This was a private man in a private decline, and most of what is known comes secondhand, after the fact, from people speaking in interviews conducted after his death in 1994, which brings the account back to that final interview and the question about regret. The reason it is worth treating carefully, rather than dramatizing, is that no verbatim transcript of his full answer survives in any source that can be independently verified. What exists are paraphrases, filtered through memory, some published years after the fact. The consistent core of those paraphrases is that he said something to the effect that he had been a poor father for long stretches of time he could not get back. That he understood this more clearly now than he had when it might have mattered, and that there was no way to undo the actual years that had been spent on sets in Italy or France or Arizona instead of at home. What makes this different from the kind of generic late-life regret that gets attached to almost any aging public figure is the specificity of what the stroke had taken from him by that point. A man who built his identity, both professional and personal, around being physically capable, around being the one who moved fastest and acted most decisively, was now sitting in a chair, needing extra time to finish a sentence, being asked to account for choices made by a much younger, much more mobile version of himself. The gap between the man who made those choices and the man being asked to answer for them was, by then, almost total. He could not even gesture the way he once had to fill the silence while he thought. He died on October 20th, 1994, of a heart attack 4 years after the stroke, and roughly 4 years after that interview, depending on which account of its date is accurate. Sources place it variously in 1991 or 1992, which is itself an indication of how loosely documented this particular conversation actually is compared to the rest of his well-chronicled public life. His children, by most reports, were present or in contact in his final years in a way that suggests at least partial repair had taken place, though partial is doing real work in that sentence, and no single account claims the breach was ever fully closed with everyone. There is a way to tell this story that turns the unanswered question into a tidy lesson about presence and family, and that version would be easy to write and would also flatten what actually seems to have happened, which is messier and less resolved. Lancaster did not get a clean redemption arc. He got a few years of slowed down, physically limited time in which some relationships improved, and at least one, by most accounts, did not fully recover, and in which he was asked, near the very end, to put into words something he had apparently never fully said out loud before. And the most honest thing the record shows is that he struggled to get the words out, not because the stroke had taken his ability to speak, but because the actual answer was harder than any line he'd ever been handed on a film set.